From the outside, Marcus Bennett seemed like any other man. He wore plain suits and carried a worn leather briefcase, the kind with creases that told stories of years of steady work. At 44 years old, he was a man defined by his routine, up at 6 a.m., coffee brewed in silence, and out the door by 6:45 to catch the downtown bus into the heart of Atlanta. There, he spent his days in a cubicle on the 14th floor of a mid-tier insurance firm, processing claims, reviewing policy renewals, and exchanging formalities with colleagues who barely knew his middle name. But what they did not know, what they could never guess, was that Marcus had another life. A secret life fueled not by spreadsheets or signatures, but by fire, flavor, and the gentle symphony of spices sizzling in a pan. Each evening, as the city lights flickered to life, Marcus changed his tie for an apron and caught another bus, this one bound for the southeastern corner of the city. There, nestled between a pawnshop and a laundromat, was the Jefferson School of Culinary Arts, a modest institution with dim hallways but brilliant instructors. It was here that Marcus became someone else, not the quiet office worker with tired eyes, but a man reborn. He wasn't the most talented in the class, nor the youngest. But what set Marcus apart was reverence. He chopped onions as if it were a sacred ritual. He listened to lectures on roux and reductions with the attentiveness of a disciple. His notebook was filled with sketches of dishes, flavor pairings, and family recipes passed down in whispered tones by his grandmother, a proud woman from South Carolina who once said, "If you cook with your heart, even the poor will eat like kings." That quote lived in Marcus's soul. His passion became obsession. On weekends, he would experiment tirelessly in his small kitchen, replicating dishes from class and adding his southern twist. Braised collard greens with apple cider vinegar, shrimp and grits with smoked paprika, and his signature, maple-glazed fried chicken served atop a sweet potato waffle. Neighbors started showing up uninvited. Friends brought friends. People asked if he had a restaurant. At first he laughed. Him? Open a restaurant? It seemed impossible. But then came the layoff rumors at work. The company was downsizing, and departments were merging. Marcus watched as colleagues in neighboring cubicles packed their belongings. He began to ask himself, what if this is not a dead end, but a door? He had saved for years, never once taking a vacation. His father had taught him to be cautious with money. Never gamble what you can't cook yourself, he used to say. But this was different. This wasn't a gamble. This was a calling. And so, one cold February morning, Marcus handed in his resignation. The HR representative looked stunned. "You're quitting to cook?" He simply nodded, smiling. With every cent of his savings and a small loan from a community development bank, Marcus leased a small vacant property in the old Fourth Ward, a neighborhood rich in history and lately in gentrification. He painted the walls himself, bought second-hand kitchen equipment from a closed-down cafe, and above the front door, he placed a hand-carved wooden sign with gold lettering, Heritage Soul. The name wasn't just branding. It was his grandmother's voice. It was Sunday dinners after church. It was collard greens and gospel, stories and sacrifice. It was every piece of him. In the beginning it was hard. He burned through more cash than expected. On some nights, only 1 or 2 tables were filled. He slept on a cot in the back room and showered at a friend's gym. He did everything himself, prepped, cooked, cleaned, served, and even took out the trash. But slowly, the city began to notice. A local food blogger wrote an article. The best fried chicken in Atlanta might be in this hidden soul kitchen. Within weeks, the lines were out the door. Diners, young and old, black and white, flocked to Heritage Soul, not just for the food, but for something harder to define: warmth, authenticity, memory. Food critics praised the balance of tradition and innovation. The cornbread was fluffy yet complex. The catfish was crisped to perfection and served with a hush puppy that melted in the mouth. But what really drew people in was Marcus. He didn't stay in the kitchen. He came out to greet guests, to ask about their day, to explain where each dish came from. He spoke with grace, not ego. He moved like a man who knew the power of food to heal. Within a year, Heritage Soul had become one of Atlanta's most beloved eateries. Marcus hired a small staff, some from his culinary school, others from the neighborhood. Business was thriving. Awards were being whispered. Investors began calling. But then, one evening in late autumn, as Marcus was preparing to leave the restaurant, his phone rang. The screen read, "Angela, sister." Her voice was trembling. "Marcus, it's Dad. He's not getting up. The doctors think it's serious. I can't do this alone." Silence fell like an avalanche. Their father, once a proud farmer, once indestructible, was now frail, barely able to speak, barely able to move. Without hesitation, Marcus called his staff into a private meeting. He appointed his sous chef Jamal as head of the kitchen. He gave full management responsibility to Grace, his trusted front-of-house manager. He promised to return soon, but made no guarantees. The next morning, he packed a single bag and boarded a bus to Orangeburg, South Carolina, the place of his childhood, the home he had once left in search of something greater. Now, he was returning for something far more important. He found his father lying in a worn armchair, eyes sunken, voice like sandpaper. The old man tried to smile but couldn't. Marcus took a deep breath and knelt beside him. "I'm home now, Pops." What followed were months of care, of humility, of rediscovery. Marcus bathed his father, fed him, read to him. They spoke of things they had avoided for years, about loss, about pride, about forgiveness. One night, after a quiet dinner of chicken broth and white rice, his father whispered, "You turned fire into purpose. I didn't see it then, but I see it now." Marcus held back tears. The old man passed away quietly weeks later, with his son beside him. The funeral was small, no cameras, no press, just family, neighbors, and the heavy silence of a chapter ending. But for Marcus, another chapter was just beginning. With grief in his heart and hope still flickering in his soul, Marcus boarded a bus back to Atlanta, unaware that the home he had built, the place where his dream lived, would soon greet him not with welcome, but with rejection. And not from strangers on the street, but from inside his very own restaurant. It was a cold, overcast morning when Marcus Bennett stepped off the bus and onto the streets of Atlanta. The city looked different. Not dramatically, but subtly, like a painting shifted a few inches off center. He had been gone for nearly 8 months, though it felt longer. Grief and caregiving had altered his sense of time. Everything moved slower now, more deliberately. As he walked through the neighborhoods he once knew intimately, Marcus noticed new signs, new faces, new shops with gleaming glass fronts. But the deeper he went into the old Fourth Ward, the more familiar things became, familiar enough to stir a knot in his stomach. And then, at the corner of Randolph Street, he saw it. Heritage Soul. The gold-lettered sign still hung above the entrance, just as he remembered it. The aroma of smoked spices and sizzling butter lingered in the air like a hymn from the past. The windows were polished. The porch had been repainted. From the outside, the restaurant looked alive, thriving even. Marcus smiled. He had expected a sense of loss or distance, but instead, he felt a surge of pride. His creation had survived without him. It was still standing, still feeding people, still telling stories with every dish served. He took a deep breath, adjusted the collar of his coat, and walked up the 3 wooden steps toward the door. Inside, the restaurant was busy. It was the lunch hour, and most tables were full, patrons chatting over plates of fried okra and cornbread, sipping sweet tea, laughing, murmuring, living. Marcus paused by the door, soaking it in. But as he took a step forward, a young man in a black apron and pressed shirt approached him swiftly. "Excuse me, sir," the man said, blocking his path. "Do you have a reservation?" Marcus blinked, slightly caught off guard. "No, I don't. I'm just here to—" "Unfortunately, we're fully booked until 3, the man interrupted, a stiff smile on his lips, but a flatness in his eyes. "We usually don't take walk-ins at this hour." "That's all right," Marcus replied calmly. "I'm not here to dine. I'm here to see someone." The young man tilted his head. "Who exactly?" Marcus hesitated for just a moment. "The manager, or the head chef. I used to work here." There was a pause, a beat too long. The waiter's eyes scanned Marcus from head to toe. His coat was simple. His shoes were dusty from travel. His face unshaven. There was no badge, no clipboard, no indication that he was someone important. "I'm sorry, sir," the young man said, his tone growing firmer, "but we do not allow people to loiter near the entrance. Our guests are trying to enjoy their meal." "I understand that," Marcus said slowly, his voice as calm as a still lake. "But if you would just let someone know that Marcus is here." "There are a lot of Marcuses in this city," the waiter replied, now with a faint hint of annoyance. "This is an upscale establishment, sir. I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." For a long moment, Marcus said nothing. He simply looked at the man standing in front of him. Young, maybe in his early 20s, skin smooth with inexperience, posture stiff with authority borrowed from a uniform. He didn't recognize Marcus. He didn't recognize the man who had built this place from nothing. The man who had scrubbed these very floors with his own hands. Marcus's heart didn't race, his fists didn't clench, but something far heavier sank in his chest. It wasn't just the insult, it was the invisibility. The young man reached for the door. "Sir, I really need you to leave." At that precise moment, Grace, the front-of-house manager he had entrusted months before, emerged from the back carrying a tray of glasses. She turned, spotted Marcus near the entrance, and froze. Her face changed instantly. Her eyes widened. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no sound came. Then, with urgency in her step, she set the tray down and made her way across the dining room. "Marcus," she said, breathless. "Oh my God. Marcus." The young waiter looked confused. "You know him?" Grace turned sharply toward him, her voice trembling with disbelief. "Do I know him? That's Marcus Bennett. He's the founder of this restaurant." The room fell into silence. People turned their heads. Forks hovered in midair. Even the kitchen staff paused behind the counter, eyes peeking through the heat and steam. The young waiter's mouth opened, but no words came. His cheeks flushed with color. I didn't know," he stammered. "I thought he was just—" "Just what?" Grace interrupted, her tone firm now. "Someone who didn't belong?" Marcus raised a hand gently. "It's all right." But it wasn't, not really. He turned to the young man who stood frozen, unsure whether to apologize or disappear. "What's your name?" Marcus asked quietly. "Ethan," the young man replied, almost in a whisper. "Well, Ethan," Marcus said, his voice calm but piercing, "I built this place with my own hands. Every brick, every recipe, every stool and table. When I left, I trusted others to carry that legacy with respect. What you did just now wasn't about rules. It was about how you saw me." Ethan looked down. Marcus continued, "One day you'll learn that people's worth isn't measured by what they wear or how they enter a room. Sometimes, the quietest person is the one who built the roof above your head." No one spoke. The room was still. Marcus turned to Grace. "Is Jamal still here?" She nodded. "In the kitchen." Without another word, Marcus walked past Ethan and through the dining room he had once designed from memory. He passed tables filled with patrons who now looked at him not as a stranger, but as someone far more complex, someone whose story was etched into every flavor they had come to love. He pushed open the swinging door to the kitchen and was met with the smell of smoked brisket and garlic butter. Behind the stove stood Jamal, now a more seasoned version of the apprentice Marcus once mentored. Jamal looked up and smiled. "Chef?" Marcus nodded. "I'm home." The kitchen had not changed much. The stainless steel counters still bore the faint scratches from years of use. The massive industrial stove still let out a soft hum like a sleeping beast. The hanging pots, organized by size and utility, reflected the overhead light with a dignified sheen. Marcus stood in the threshold, observing it all as one might look upon a childhood home that had been tended to in their absence. Jamal moved quickly across the floor, plating catfish over a cornmeal mash with precision. But when his eyes met Marcus's, his entire body stilled. The ladle in his hand trembled ever so slightly. "Chef," Jamal said again, his voice lower now. "I didn't think you'd be back so soon." Marcus stepped forward, his gaze scanning the kitchen. The team froze in place. Even the sizzle of a pan seemed to quiet in reverence. 8 months, Marcus replied. "Feels like a lifetime." There was no accusation in his voice, just gravity, just presence. Jamal set down the ladle and walked toward him, wiping his hands on a clean towel tucked into his apron. "I tried to hold it together," he said. "Grace, too. We did our best, but without your hands on the stove, something was missing." Marcus gave a soft nod. "I trust both of you. I always did. But some things, they change when the heart steps away." He glanced around the kitchen. The menu board had evolved. New dishes were featured, seasonal specials added. The layout had shifted slightly for efficiency. There was growth here, adaptation, but there was also something else, a subtle chill beneath the surface. "Tell me," Marcus said, looking back to Jamal, "what happened while I was gone?" Jamal hesitated. "We kept it running. The business was strong, but the tone, the energy, shifted. More investors came knocking. Some offered to expand the brand, replicate it in other neighborhoods. One of them even suggested franchising." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "Franchising?" Jamal nodded reluctantly. "I said no. But the pressure was there. People started caring more about presentation than intention, about margins than meaning." Marcus took a deep breath and leaned against the counter where he once spent endless nights stirring gumbo and perfecting his grandmother's sweet potato pie. He remembered when he could name every farmer who grew his ingredients, when every server could recite the story behind the collard greens and why they mattered to the soul of the place. "Did they forget why this place was built?" Marcus asked, not accusingly, but with quiet grief. "Some did," Jamal said. "Others never knew." At that, Marcus turned back to the swinging doors and pushed them open. He emerged into the dining area like a tide returning to the shore. Patrons who had witnessed the earlier scene now whispered and watched. But Marcus didn't acknowledge the stares. Instead, he walked slowly toward the far left corner of the restaurant, toward the wall of photographs. It was still there, a collage of black and white and sepia-toned images. His grandmother at her wood-burning stove, his father harvesting okra from their garden, Marcus himself, much younger, stirring a pot beside a boyish Jamal, photos of community gatherings, old church picnics, and handwritten recipes framed in gold. But something was missing. There was a blank space on the wall. A frame that once held a photo of Marcus in the early days of Heritage Soul, covered in flour, grinning beside a tray of peach cobbler. "Where's the photo?" he asked. Grace, now standing a few steps behind him, answered softly. "It was taken down during renovations. No one remembered to put it back up." No one remembered. The words hung in the air like a bitter fog. Marcus closed his eyes. In that moment, the restaurant did not feel like his anymore. It had become something else, a living, breathing organism that had forgotten its own origin. But just as despair began to creep in, a voice broke through the noise. "Mr. Bennett?" He turned. An elderly woman stood near the entrance, holding a cane and a small paper bag. She wore a navy blue coat, and her hair was wrapped neatly in a silk scarf. Her eyes, however, were sharp, clear and deliberate. "I heard you were back," she said. "My grandson works in the kitchen, told me what happened earlier. I had to come see for myself." Marcus offered a soft smile. "Ms. Caroline, you're always welcome here." She approached slowly, then reached into the paper bag. "I kept this," she said, pulling out a folded newspaper. "The day your restaurant opened, you gave me this peach cobbler, and I said it tasted like my mama's. Do you remember?" He nodded. "I remember. You said I made you cry." She chuckled. "You did, and I kept coming back, not just for the food, but because this place made me feel seen." She looked around the restaurant. "I don't know what it's become now. It's fancier, but I hope it doesn't forget what it used to be." She placed the newspaper gently in his hand. "Welcome home, son." As she turned to leave, several patrons at nearby tables stood and clapped quietly, not loudly, not for attention, but with sincerity. One by one, they nodded to Marcus as he looked around the room. Some smiled. Others seemed ashamed, but the energy had shifted. He was no longer invisible. That night, after the restaurant closed and the last chair had been stacked, Marcus stood alone in the kitchen. He reopened the old recipe journal he had carried for years. Inside, faded by time, was the first note he had ever written to himself as a chef. "Cook for the memory, serve for the dignity, protect the soul." The silence of the room was broken only by the sound of him lighting the stove. He placed a heavy skillet on the flame, and as the oil heated, he rolled up his sleeves. He had a dish in mind, one he hadn't made since the day the restaurant opened. Outside, the night deepened. Inside, Marcus began to cook again, not for fame, not for business, but for the soul that had been forgotten. The morning after his quiet return to the kitchen, Marcus awoke before dawn. The city was still asleep, its towers cloaked in a gray veil of fog. He sat by the small window of his modest apartment, an apartment he had kept even during his absence, and watched the stillness unfold, as though the world itself were holding its breath. The silence reminded him of home, of the long nights spent beside his father's bed, listening to labored breathing, waiting for the next sunrise. Now that silence echoed differently. It was the stillness before a change, before something inevitable. By 7 a.m., Marcus was back at Heritage Soul. He didn't enter through the front door this time. He chose the side alley, the same path he used to take during those early days, when no one knew his name, when he cooked alone in the dark, with nothing but the flame of purpose lighting his way. He passed the old crate where he once sat during breaks, drinking iced tea and dreaming of crowds that would one day line up outside. That dream had come true, but now he was unsure what remained of it. Inside, the kitchen was already humming with the energy of preparation. Jamal looked up from his cutting board. "You're early," he said. "I never stopped being," Marcus replied. There were no more words needed. Jamal stepped aside, offering Marcus his old station. The burners, the knives, the spices, they were all waiting for him, as if time itself had paused for this return. Marcus worked in silence, but his presence radiated authority. The staff watched him, not with fear, but with reverence. A few had never seen him in action before. Now, they understood why the walls still whispered his name, even when the world outside had forgotten it. As the lunch hour approached, the team gathered briefly for pre-service briefing. Grace entered, carrying the day's reservations list and a folded piece of paper in her hand. "There's something you should see," she said, handing Marcus the paper. It was a printed email from an online food magazine that had once praised his peach cobbler. They were preparing an article, "The Evolution of Soul: How Heritage Soul Became a Symbol of Modern Culinary Fusion." At first, Marcus was flattered, but as he read further, the tone changed. The article positioned the restaurant not as a tribute to heritage, but as a successful pivot from traditional Southern dishes to minimalist modern cuisine. His name was mentioned only once, in passing. There was no mention of his family, No mention of the community. No mention of the story behind the name. I didn't approve this, Grace said. They must have gotten access from the investor group that's been trying to buy in. Marcus folded the paper carefully. I need to speak, he said. Tonight, when the room is full. Grace looked up. You want to speak to the guests? No, Marcus replied. I want to speak to everyone. The guests, the staff, the city. That evening, the restaurant buzzed with the familiar energy of a Saturday night service. Tables were full. Laughter echoed. Forks clinked against plates. The kitchen moved like a ballet. Orders came in steady waves. Dishes left the past like works of art. But behind the scenes, a different preparation was underway. Grace had dimmed the main lights. A single spotlight now illuminated the photo wall, newly restored, now complete. Marcus's photo had been reinstalled, cleaned, and framed with a small brass plaque underneath. Founder, chef, storyteller. At precisely 8:15 p.m., Marcus emerged from the kitchen. He stood near the photo wall, dressed in his chef's coat, clean, pressed, yet marked with small stains from the evening's work. He held nothing in his hands, no notes, no microphone, only the quiet weight of truth. Good evening, he said, his voice rising above the murmur. One by one, conversations faded. Forks were lowered. All eyes turned to the man standing in front of the wall of memory. My name, he said, is Marcus Bennett. I am the founder of Heritage Soul. There was a beat of silence. Some of you have dined here for months, some perhaps for the first time tonight. You've tasted our food, heard our music, read our menu. But there is a story behind every bite you've taken, and I think it's time you heard it. He paused, letting the moment settle. This restaurant was born out of memory. My grandmother's kitchen, my father's garden, the hands of my mother, who measured spices without cups, but with instinct. The collard greens you eat tonight, they come from fields where my people once labored without choice. The cornbread, that's Sunday supper in a house without heat. The cobbler, that's forgiveness, baked into sweetness. A quiet murmur rose in the room. A few people lowered their heads. Others leaned in, eyes wide. Marcus continued. 8 months ago, I left this place to care for my father. He was dying. I thought I was leaving for a short while. But when I returned, something had shifted. My photo was gone, my story was nearly erased, and last week I walked into my own restaurant and was told I didn't belong. He looked toward the front, where Ethan, the young waiter, now stood behind the podium. Ethan didn't speak. He didn't move. He simply watched, his face unreadable. I don't share this to shame anyone, Marcus said. I share it because silence has a cost. Because when we forget where something comes from, we risk destroying its soul. He gestured toward the photo wall. This is not just a restaurant. This is a place of remembrance, of culture, of struggle and triumph. We serve food here. But what we offer is deeper. It is belonging. It is identity. And I will not allow it to be diluted for comfort or profit. The room was still. Not a single fork moved. Marcus stepped away from the wall and returned to the center of the dining floor. I'm not asking for applause. I'm not asking for pity. I'm simply asking that you see us, that you see me, that you see the story behind the plate before you. He looked around the room, his eyes meeting patrons one by one. If you came for good food, he said gently, you'll find it. But if you came to understand the flavor of history, of dignity, of soul, then welcome home. The room erupted in quiet, powerful applause, not thunderous, but sincere, from the heart. Ethan approached him slowly after the guests had resumed their meals. I'm sorry, he said. I judged you by the wrong lens. Marcus looked at him, not with anger, but with patience. People often do, he said. But the real lesson is not in what you did, it's in what you choose to do now. Ethan nodded. I'd like to stay and learn. Marcus offered a single solemn nod. Then start by listening. Not just with your ears, but with your hands, with your heart. That night, Marcus returned to the kitchen. But something had changed. The staff moved differently. The tone had shifted. There was a reverence in the air, not for a man, but for a mission. Marcus picked up a ladle, stirred the gumbo, and glanced at the stove with eyes full of memory. Heritage Soul had remembered itself, but outside those walls, the world was still forgetting. Weeks had passed since the night Marcus Bennett reclaimed his voice and his legacy inside the four walls of Heritage Soul. Yet something deeper than vindication stirred within him. What he had restored publicly, he now needed to repair privately, not in the eyes of others, but in the silence of his own soul. The restaurant continued to thrive, but Marcus no longer measured success by the number of reservations or 5-star reviews. He returned to the early hours, arriving long before the first shift, unlocking the door himself. There, in the stillness, he cooked not for guests, but for the memory of those who had once stood beside him. He made collard greens, just as his grandmother had, slow-cooked with smoked turkey necks. He boiled sweet potatoes until they surrendered, mashed them gently with cinnamon and brown sugar, and folded them into biscuit dough, the same recipe written by hand on a faded page, now framed on his kitchen wall. Some mornings, he cooked meals and delivered them quietly to elders in the community. He never announced his visits. He left warm trays at doorsteps, knocked gently, and walked away before they could thank him. For Marcus, food had always been more than nourishment. It was a bridge between generations, between pain and healing, between what was lost and what could still be reclaimed. Inside the restaurant, small changes were taking root. Ethan, the young waiter who once had dismissed Marcus at the door, now arrived early for shifts, volunteering in the kitchen during off hours. He listened. He took notes. He asked questions not just about recipes, but about stories. "Why do you always toast the garlic before adding it to the greens?" he asked one afternoon. Marcus, eyes on the sizzling pan, answered without looking up. "Because bitterness must always be softened before it becomes part of something whole." Ethan nodded, absorbing not just the technique, but the philosophy. The staff began to feel it too. There was a new rhythm to their movements, one guided not by speed, but by intention. Grace implemented a policy to rotate historical dishes from different Southern Black communities, each accompanied by a brief story on the menu. Guests were encouraged to ask, and they did. People came not only to eat, but to listen. Heritage Soul had become a place of memory and motion, yet Marcus still felt a restlessness. One night, after closing, he sat alone at table 7, his favorite, the same table where his father once ate in silence, chewing slowly, nodding only once at the end. "That's food with a spine," he had said. "It remembers." Now Marcus held a letter in his hands. It was addressed from a development firm in Midtown, offering a substantial investment in exchange for partial ownership. The offer promised expansion, replication, franchising, precisely what he had once dreamed of. But the proposal came with fine print, changes to the menu, branding adjustments, visual reworks, and above all, scalability. He read it once, then again, and then he placed it gently beside a framed photo of his grandmother. "How do you scale a memory?" he whispered. The next morning, Marcus called a meeting. His staff gathered in the dining room, chefs, waiters, dishwashers, hosts. No titles mattered now. Only their hands, their hearts, and what they had built together. "There's an offer on the table," Marcus said. "A big one. We could become a chain. We could open locations in every major city. But to do that, we would have to compromise what this place is, and who we are." He paused, looked around. I won't make that decision alone. Because this place isn't mine anymore. It's ours. The room was silent for a long time. Then Jamal spoke first. If it means losing the soul of what we built, then what's the point of multiplying it? Grace nodded. Let others chase numbers. We're here to hold the roots. Ethan, younger but now braver, stepped forward. Let's grow deeper, not wider. And so it was decided. Heritage Soul would remain one location, one kitchen, one story, told honestly, without distortion, without dilution. Not because they feared growth, but because they valued authenticity more than applause. In the months that followed, the restaurant partnered with local schools to offer culinary workshops to underserved youth. Marcus returned to the Culinary Institute he once attended, not as a student, but as a guest speaker, sharing not just recipes, but resilience. One night, as the sun dipped below the Atlanta skyline, a small community dinner was held at Heritage Soul. The tables were pushed together to form one long communal line. No menus were handed out. Dishes came as they were ready, family style, as it had always been. Neighbors, strangers, elders, children, all shared the same plates. And Marcus? He didn't speak that night. He didn't need to. He stood behind the counter, apron dusted with flour, watching the room, watching people gather, watching them remember, watching them feel something that could not be franchised. 1 year later, a letter arrived at the restaurant. It was handwritten, no return address. Dear Marcus, I visited your restaurant last summer. I didn't say anything at the time, but I watched you work. And I felt something I haven't felt in years, safe, seen, whole. Thank you for reminding me that the soul is not a metaphor. It is a place. And sometimes, if we are lucky, we get to eat there. Marcus folded the letter, placed it beside the recipe book his grandmother once gave him, and exhaled. The world was still changing, fast, loud, hungry for convenience. But inside Heritage Soul, time slowed just enough to remember.